Good afternoon. Welcome to the English Speaking Union Happy Hour. Today's guest speaker is David Richards, who will be speaking about Kipling's Kim, The Great Game, and Real Spies. My name is Barbara Hughes. I'm a member of the Happy Hour Committee, as well as a national board member. I would like to thank the ESU Greenwich branch, which is sponsoring today's happy hour. Ideas for our happy hour lectures come from ESU members and viewers like you. At the end of this program, you will receive a survey in your email where you're encouraged to share your feedback about today's program. And also, you are welcome to suggest ideas for upcoming happy hour lectures. Some other notes about today's presentation. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the program. You may submit your questions at any time during the program using the dedicated Q&A module at the bottom of your Zoom screen. However, questions will be answered in the order that they are received. I am so delighted today to announce that we have 179 people registered for today's lecture. And I'd like to share the names of the branches with the most registered members today. They are Greenwich, New Orleans, Central Florida, and New York. Now I would like to take a minute to introduce Natalie Prey. Natalie is the current president of the Greenwich branch. And she also serves on the board of directors for the Palm Beach branch. Natalie has recently received, within the past year, an award for her over 20 years of dedicated service to the English-speaking Union. And her award was presented by Her Royal Highness Princess Anne at our gala, our ESU gala this past year. Natalie has the honor of introducing David Richards to you. Natalie.
Thank you, Barbara. And it's a pleasure to introduce David Richards, who spoke to the Greenwich branch at one of our events. And it was very well received, and members really appreciated David's bringing alive the classic book, Kim, and especially its relationship to today, and how the sort of romantic aspect of Spies has evolved in current literature and films. And we really appreciated David's talk and the description of The Great Game, which was a classic time in history. And David, thank you again.
Good afternoon. It was Kipling who introduced the reading public to the romance of the international spy, a character who became a hero of 20th century popular literature and film. His great novel of 1901, Kim, is a narrative of both the spiritual quest in which the Teshu Lama, a Tibetan monk, goes in search of a river where the Buddha's arrow has landed, and of international intrigue in the playing of the great game, the term Kipling's book made current, between Great Britain and Russia for control of the Indian subcontinent. The boy, Kim, learns to spy for the British while on a journey as chela, or disciple, to a holy man. The author himself called the book nakedly picaresque and plotless, a thing imposed from without, meaning it was episodic, like Cervantes' Don Quixote. The narrative recounts the wanderings of the Anglo-Irish-Indian orphan Kimball O'Hara, or Kim, on his sudden choice to accompany a lama on a religious quest, which leads, through Kim's friendship with the native horse trader Amu Bali, working for the British spymaster Colonel Crichton, to the pursuit and final expulsion of two foreign agents, a Russian and a Frenchman, disguised as hunters, trying to stir up trouble in the Northwest frontier region. Through Mahbub, Kim is introduced to the Bengali Babu, an agent for the British, Hari Chandra Mukherjee, who's disguised as a surveyor to give cover for his travels near the contested frontier. The Babu describes to Kim the foreign spies' effectiveness at sowing rebellion among the border tribes. Quote, "They make promises, they speak as the mouthpiece of a Kaiser with gifts. They make the five kings to believe that a great army will sweep the passes tomorrow or the next day. You think no one dare conspire. That is all tommyrot." This is a map of the Punjab with its neighboring mountain ranges. A quarter century before publishing Kim in 1901, the 16-and-a-half-year-old Kipling, no doubt influenced by his parents' letters from the Northwest India, had proposed a school debate at United Services College that, quote, "The advance of Russia in Central Asia is hostile to British power," and the schoolboy carried his motion by 21 votes to 9. The alarm he raised about the Russians as a schoolboy had not been put aside by 1885, when for his newspaper, the Civil and Military Gazette, he covered the negotiations of the viceroy, shown here, Lord Dufferin, with the Emir of Afghanistan at Rawalpindi to keep the Emir from deserting to the Russians. His fear and loathing of the Ruskies was expressed again in Kipling's 1890 story, The Man Who Was, about a British soldier of the White Hussars captured in the Crimean War, but imprisoned by the Russians for 30 years before his escape. He crawls into his regimental mess in Peshawar on an evening when a visiting Russian officer is the regiment's guest of honor and remembers him as a captive. The same feeling is to be found in Kipling's poem of 1898, The Truce of the Bear, stressing the danger of thinking that the Russians ever accepted defeat on the Northwest frontier. There is no truce with Adamzad, the bear that looks like a man. That loathing had not been put aside by 1936, the year he died. In his final will, drawn up 10 days before his death, Kipling stipulated that no investment in Russian stocks should be made by the trustee of his estate. Here we have a map of the empire. For Great Britain in the 1880s, the geopolitical rules of the Great Game were founded on certain assumptions. First, India was too important to lose economically. Second, Britain's credibility as a great power could not have survived the subcontinent's loss. Third, the so-called jewel in the crown had become part of the national identity. And in an age of jostling empires, India acted as a crucial hub, as you can see here, for all British possessions in the East, and was the base for further expansion. The next image is of the Bohan Pass, the southern counterpart of the Khyber Pass, with British troops marching north in the first Anglo-Afghan War, which meant that Russians could march this way south. The best way to protect India against a Russian attack through Afghanistan, it was concluded by the British Foreign Ministry in 1830 and onwards, was to keep Russia out of that country. The British strategy, therefore, was to employ the decaying regimes of Islamic Asia as a gigantic buffer between British India and the threatening Russians, to stop them from establishing any sort of presence on those dominating heights of the high mountain ranges in and adjoining Afghanistan, from which invaders could pour down into the plains of India. This next is a map of those invasion routes. The Bolan Pass to the bottom of your screen, the Khyber to the middle, and a third coming in through the north near the Pamirs. Britain, conversely, had no desire to advance from India to Russia because whatever she took would be beyond the range of her sea power to hold. There are not one, but two ironies here. The first is that all the expeditions toward the Indian frontier, which were contemplated by the Russians, had as their purpose not invasion, as the British feared, but the inflaming of internal unrest, forcing Britain to increase the garrison and thereby reducing the power to defy Russia in Europe. The second irony, of course, is that after a century of defense policy, assuming that the attackers would be Russian and that the attack would come from the Northwest, in World War II, the attackers turned out to be the Japanese, and they came from the East, from Burma. Still, Russians' territorial advances were alarming. In 1880, the frontiers between the Russian Empire and British India were 2,000 miles apart. Again, by 1876, that distance had been cut in half. And in the 2 decades between 1867 and 1886, the Russians had acquired control of an additional 1,376,874 square miles in Central Asia. The very naming of Queen Victoria as Empress of India, the Khazar-e-Hind, had been part of Great Britain's grand strategy, announced before that Afghan war by Disraeli's hand-picked new viceroy, shown here, Lord Lytton, in Delhi at the Imperial Assembly. That Durbar featured a vivid firmament of uniforms worn variously by the 11th Hussars, the Bengal Lancers, the Bombay Cavalry, and all troops of the 63 ruling chiefs in a display of overwhelming military capability, a visible message to other European powers, but to Russia in particular, which might be counting on the instability of the Ottoman Empire to further their Eastern spheres of influence. This next image is a painting of the Imperial Assembly. The heraldic banners, which you see in the background, were designed by Kipling's father, while the 12-year-old was still being boarded in England. Furthermore, the great game sounded more equal if a Russian czar was opposed by an Indian empress. Here is Queen Victoria on a throne presented by the Maharaja of Travancore. The Queen's new titles as Empress, in both English and Hindustani, were stamped on the gold and silver medals presented at the Imperial Assemblage to the attending individual dignitaries, pictured in our next image. In March 1898, while Kipling was writing Kim, a 23-year-old subaltern in the 4th Hussars on the northwestern frontier published his first book. This subaltern, the not yet famous Winston Churchill, described the genesis of the newly evolving forward policy. Instead of depending on the line of the mountains, as it was called, as the national defense, they would depend on, quote, the purely defensive principle had to be modified in favor of that system of punitive expeditions. He continued, quote, as long as the border could remain a no man's land, as it were, a great gulf fixed, all was well. But if any power was to be supreme, that power must neither be Russian nor Afghanistan. The predominance of Russian influence, Churchill continued in this book, in these territories would give them the power to invade India at their discretion, with what chances of success need not be here discussed, close quote. 3 years later in Kim is the very same pessimism. Kipling was less than sanguine about Britain's imperial future. Notably, the espionage action in Kim begins with the real-world outbreak of the Chitral Rebellion, which led to Churchill's service in the Malacan Field Force. Kipling's spy master, Mahbub Ali, sends the first intelligence of the outbreak to his superior, Colonel Crichton, with Kim carrying the coded message. The phrase "the great game" is said to have originated with a Bengali cavalry officer, Arthur Conolly, who came to believe that it was his personal mission to frustrate Russian schemes of conquest in Central Asia and to convince its independent Muslim rulers to band together and seek British protection. And he employed the phrase, the Great Game, in 1838 in his narrative of an overland journey to the north of India. The Russians had their own sporting metaphor for the contest. In 1837, Count Carré Valisevich Nesselrode, the Tsar's foreign minister, called it Tournament of Shadows. Ironically, historians consider the effective end of the Great Game to have occurred before the publication of Kim, at the signing, shown here, on 10 September 1895 of the Pamir Boundary Commission Protocols, when the border between Afghanistan and the Russian Empire was defined. After that, there was thought to be considerably less need for information about Russia in Central Asia. Kipling's novel, appearing fully 6 years later, revived the popularity of the term the Great Game and introduced the new implication of great power rivalry. Kipling, of course, was hardly alone in using the metaphor of a game for spying or war. This had been nurtured by such poets as John Masefield and, seen here, Sir Henry John Newbold, whose Vita Lampada of 1898, a public school favorite, begins with the image of the school cricket match and ends with a description of boys at war, concluding, "The river of death has brimmed its banks, and England's far and honors a name, but the voice of a schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game." This talk's subject is not to review again the manifold glories and confusions of Kim as a work of world literature, its dust jackets sewn here, but to consider the hold of the author's protagonist was to cast on real spies in their government's secret services in Great Britain and the United States, and on the novelists who wrote about those agencies. Still, one bit of literary criticism might be quoted here. In the words of the Oxford academic J.I.M. Stewart, quote, "It is the task of the courageous, the resourceful, and the bold to guard the frontier, to hold the wall. But this divided loyalty scarcely means that Kim has to make a choice. That choice has been made for him by the whole structure of the society which has brought him up. It is his destiny to play the Great Game. Cunning may enable him to obtain, within the rules of the game, a role in which he can serve and protect his Lama still, but he is a servant and protector, not a disciple. It is too high for me," he says, when his master has preached his most impressive sermon. Playing one's role well in the Great Game is Kipling's metaphor for living the heroic life, and the British Secret Service in India serves as a trope to suggest a brotherhood of those dedicated to the heroic life. Through Kipling's imagination, the real life of British Secret Service in India has been transformed into a sort of secret brotherhood whose mission is to protect the people it serves from the chaos and evil that threatens from without. These brothers, of whom only one is white, are the spy master, Colonel Crichton, here depicted in the movie Kim by the actor Robert Douglas, the Afghan horse trader, Mahbub Ali, as sculpted by Kipling's father in an illustration for his son's novel, the Babu, Hari Chandra Mukherjee, again by John Lockwood Kipling, a bas-relief in the novel, and the mysterious storekeeper and spy trainer in Simla, Lurgan Sahib, this a modern imaging. Lurgan trains Kim in the powers of observation, making him look at a tray of jewels for a brief moment and then recite their descriptions from memory. And Kim, in a moment of self-realization, takes to their spy master Crichton, as in Kipling words, quote, "a man after his own heart, a tortuous and indirect person playing a hidden game." Some critics have argued that Kim has not had to elect a career by the end of the novel. While technically right, Kim is mute after the Lama's final speech, appealing to the boy to accompany him further, despite having ended the Lama's quest for the arrow. He can be reticent about his future for only so long, and it seems to me that Kim's silence betokens his entry into the Great Game, But this doubt ignores as well our hero's sudden blooding by experience in the field, upon meeting two spies posing as hunters of wild goats, but bearing surveyors' chains and levels and compasses to enable them to measure incursion routes across the border. This is Kim's fight with the foreign spies. Contemplating the future joy of being an assistant chainman for the novel's fictional ethnographical survey, Kim is suddenly at age 17 in what he calls a damn tight place, thinking in English, compelled to attack and lame with a kick in the groin an adult stranger, the Russian spy who had struck the llama, and then bang his head against a boulder. The boy says, would I had killed him, and then escape in a hail of gunfire from the revolver of the Russian's companion, the French spy. With Mahbub's fortuitously gifted .450 revolver, he returns fire, uncertainly, the novel says, and, quote, as a player in the great game, to reverence the Babu, quickly executes Hurry's battlefield order to find and rifle the foreign agents' saddlebags for evidence of their treachery with the tribal chieftains. The subsequent responsibility of hiding and bearing the, quote, oilskin packet of letters and the locked books and diaries causes the youngster to break down. But at Kim's depression's end, he reflects on Hurry's quick thinking and continued peril in accompanying the spies to Shimla, and they're together having engineered, quote, the collapse of their great game. Kim concludes in admiration, I must get into the world again. This is Hurry and the two spies, pictured in a French translation of Kim. Britain's leading historian of intelligence, Cambridge University's Christopher Andrew, has called Kim, quote, probably the finest of all spy novels, though it transcends the world of espionage. In the novel, as discussed, the ubiquitous agents of the British Raj play, quote, the great game that never ceases day or night throughout India, doing it with a subtlety quite beyond the capacity of Tsarist Russia, called the dread power of the North, and its French ally, whose emissaries are smitten helpless. At the date of Kim's composition, we have to remember, it was the Franco-Russian alliance which was regarded as the principal international threat to Britain in threatening a pincer movement. In truth, the British Army was the last in Europe to form a Department of Military Intelligence. The Army in India lagged well behind, not creating an intelligence organization until 1879, and then comprised of only 3 officers, 3 native clerks, and a munshi, an interpreter. And its sphere of responsibility, which included, of course, Central Asia, excluded territory already annexed by Russia. That was covered by the intelligence director in London. And Russia was included in the section which dealt with Spain, Portugal, and Polynesia. From the 1860s, there was only one expert on Russia in the whole of Whitehall, attached indeed to the Indian office, but only in 1876 was it recommended that his studies of Russia and his translations should even be made available to the Foreign Office and the War Office. This is Kipling in his Vermont home in Brattleboro, writing Kim. In that novel, which from internal evidence seems to occur in the years 1893 to 1898, Kipling describes an espionage network, quote, so large that one sees but little at a time. The novel's numbering system for the agents suggests as much. If there is a C-25, which is Kipling's code name for Mahbub Ali, there must be 24 other Cs. And if an R-27, Kipling's code for the Babu Hurry, surely 16 other Rs. And if Cs and Rs, there must be Ds through S's as well. Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, called the book, quote, the foundation legend of the British Secret Service. The legend, she went on, of the great game as told by Rudyard Kipling in Kim. Mahbub Ali tells Kim, quote, the game is so large that one sees but a little at a time. Historian Andrew observes that so far as the War Office was concerned, the myth of a far-flung intelligence network, whether promulgated by Kipling or lesser literary talents like William Le Queux, whose England's Peril, a story of the Secret Service about a French spy master, was published in 1900, had the incidental advantage of avoiding public revelation of British intelligence weakness. The War Office itself concluded the only consolation is that every foreign government implicitly believes that we already have a thoroughly organized and efficient Secret Service, close quote. The work of both writers demonstrates that the powers chiefly suspected of designs on the bare throat of empire were Britain's oldest enemy, France, across the narrow channel, and recently guilty of a frontal challenge in Africa for Shoda, and her Russian ally, menacing India. In time, after the settling of broader Asian differences with Russia, with signing of the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, before which there never was a real battle or even an armed skirmish, the new threat for Britain became the alarming machinations of German intelligence. And in October 1909, the government created the foreign section of a new Secret Service bureau. Within a year, these had given way to a home department responsible for counter-espionage, the ancestor of MI5, and a foreign department in charge of espionage, the forerunner of the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, the home to the fictional spies James Bond and George Smiley, and the real agents and later spy novelists Somerset Maugham, Ian Fleming, Graham Greene, and John le Carré. And the fictional boy, Kim, was mightily admired by living men who became real spies, not only Britons, but Americans, even to the point of assuming Kim's name. Of these, it has been fairly said by the intelligence historian Thomas Powers, quote, they tended to be white Anglo-Saxon politicians from families with old money, at least at the beginning, and they somehow inherited traditional British attitudes toward the colored races of the world, not the Pukka Sahib arrogance of the Indian Raj, but the fascination and condescension of men like T.E. Lawrence, who were enthusiastic participants of alien cultures into which they dipped for a time and rarely doubted their ability to help until it was too late, close quote. Allen Dulles, dying in 1969, the younger brother of Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who after World War II service in Switzerland with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, running an espionage network, helped draft the legislation that created the Central Intelligence Agency, and served as its deputy director, and then from 1953 to 1961, serving as its most important director in the CIA's first half century. This is his CIA card, number A1. For him, Kipling's great game was a renewed contest with the Soviet Union following the Second World War for control of the entire globe, that Dulles pursued with a patriot's devotion, an appetite for combat, and the elastic sense of the permissible. In a Cold War that began on 17 May 1945 and lasted until the Berlin Wall came down on 9 November 1989. A Princeton graduate and a Presbyterian, he had early in his career spent a year teaching English in an Indian mission school in Allahabad, where Kipling had once worked as a journalist. While there, Dulles attended meetings of the anti-colonialist movement and met Motilal Nehru and his son, Jawaharlal, the future prime minister, then just back from Cambridge University. Dulles first read Kim in 1914, just after his Princeton graduation, sailing towards India to take up his teaching post, and he kept it with him his whole life. The well-worn copy was on his bedside table when he died. Later in his career, when a guest lecturer at Yale, Dulles, one of whose nickname was the Great White Case Officer, acted Colonel Crichton, meeting with a large group of students interested in a career with the CIA, using the corporation room in Yale's headquarters building, Woodbridge Hall. The movie adaptation of Kim, to which film rights were first acquired in 1923, had a rockier passage to production. And by the time the latest rights holder, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, was ready to proceed, World War II had begun, and the British had become a fraught subject in rest of India. The U.S. Office of War Information banned the making of Kim and a reissue of Ganga Din, which had come out in 1939, because they, quote, might upset our prospective Indian allies. The new government of India gave permission to film there in 1947, and Kim was finally filmed in Technicolor in 1951, with Dean Stockwell as Kim and Errol Flynn as Mahbub Ali. But the French and Russian spies of the novel were transformed now into two Russians, reflecting the paranoia of the Cold War. One of Dulles' favorite officers was Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., who died in 2000. He was a Harvard-educated Arabist and a Kipling devotee. His father, the first Kermit, as a 14-year-old in 1903, just 2 years after the book Kim's publication, accompanied President Roosevelt on a trip to the Badlands, where TR in 1884 had become friends with Sheriff Seth Bullock, made newly famous in this century by the television series Deadwood. Bullock, the real Bullock, nicknamed the boy Kim because he reminded the lawman of the friendly boy in Kipling's novel. Kim became thereafter the standard nickname for the generations of Kermits in the Roosevelt clan. Kermit Jr., editor of the OSS's official 2-volume history, moved with many of his officers directly into the CIA, joining its Office of Policy Coordination. In his book of 1949, Arabs, Oil, and History, he urged payback for Soviet expansion of minority discontents in the West by using Afghanistan as the springboard for sowing discord in Soviet Central Asia and the Russian Caucasus, the great game now being played by reverse by the USA. Assigned to Egypt, he aided in that country's army's move to carry out the Free Officers' coup d'etat in 1952, which installed Nasser, part of Roosevelt's strategic notion of America forming an alliance with Arab countries as they emerged from under the sway of Britain and France as the Cold War gathered momentum. More notoriously, he was the architect of the CIA's successful effort in 1953 to overthrow Mossadegh, the Mahis-appointed leader of Iran, installing in his place Shah Reza Pahlavi, the consequences of which still poison Iranian-Americans' relations. Dulles' tenure and his fascination with Kim cast a long shadow. When the British military historian John Keegan visited the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters at Langley in 1984, what impressed him most was its resemblance to British India's political and secret service in the day of the Raj. He wrote in this book, War Past, "Vietnam was our Raj," one of its old field hands once said to me. The CIA does indeed carry on the traditions of the Indian political service, the ethos of Kim and the Great Game. Mediation between the old power of Anglo-Saxon world and the new is the CIA's calling. It has assumed the mantle once worn by Kim's masters as if it were a seamless garment, close quote. One final American intelligence officer must be mentioned, Edward Lansdale, born 1908, died 1987, a former Air Force officer, CIA operative, and another favored lieutenant of Allen Dulles. He'd masterminded the defeat of the Huk Rebellion, communist uprising in the Philippines, and engineered the election of his friend Raymond Magsaysay as that country's president in the early 1950s. He was sent to Saigon in 1954, and there he guided another neophyte leader on behalf of the CIA, Ngo Diem. Lansdale organized teams to carry out secret operations in North Vietnam. He encouraged anti-communist Catholics to emigrate south, and he scouted out possible leaders among the competing private armies and local strongmen of Saigon and its surroundings before settling on Diem. Uniting this complex portfolio in Lansdale's mind was the inspiring figure of Rudyard Kipling. he wrote in his memoir, In the Midst of Wars, Vietnam was so filled with the arcane that I used to advise Americans to read Kipling's Kim and pay heed to the description of young Kimball O'Hara's counterintelligence training in the awareness of illusions, close quote. Lurgan Sahib's Game of Jewels was now used by Lansdale to train American operatives performing Lansdale's deception operations in North Vietnam. The two figures whose novels about spies did not make them spy novelists, but whose influence created the anxiety under which later thriller writers labored, were Rudyard Kipling and Joseph Conrad. The heroic and romance of adventure of spying in the defense of empire comes from Kipling's Kim, as we had seen, 1901, and the cynical, realistic story of intrigue, betrayal, and double agents was established by Conrad's The Secret Agent in 1907. The game is central to the thriller. The Great Game, Kipling's term for the Secret Service in Kim, fitted the boy's fantasy of living between two cultures, English and Indian, a sort of double agent without the anxiety of the Cold War, but it also stuck as a term for espionage in succeeding thrillers. Kipling's younger contemporary shown here and servant of empire, John Buchan, who died in office as Governor General of Canada in 1940, has been called, quote, the father of the modern spy thriller, whose books are about the penetration of the enemy, about lonely escape and wild journeys, about the thin veneer that stands between civilization and barbarism, even in the most elegant drawing room in London, close quote. Working over Kipling as one of a stable of authors in Britain's World War I propaganda bureau, serving as its director of information, Buchan was a fellow member of Kipling's London dining clubs, and they shared the same literary agent. In Buchan's series of thrillers, he developed one Kim-like hero, Sandy Arbuthnot, an accomplished linguist and master of disguise. After his book 39 Steps, appearing in 1915, Buchan's second most well-known thriller is Greenmantle of 1916, which indeed was his best-selling book. It features both Richard Hannay of the 39 Steps, the first novel, and Sandy Arbuthnot, who goes east as a dancing dervish, like Daniel Dravit's disguise in Leaving for Kafiristan in Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King. Describing Arbuthnot, Hannay reflects smugly, quote, we call ourselves insular, but the truth is that we English are the only race on earth that can produce men capable of getting inside the skin of remote peoples, close quote. In Kim, the teenager is disguised by a prostitute, quote, dabbing a twist of cloth into a little saucer of brown dye that holds longer than walnut juice. Greenmantle, in which Germany makes use of a Muslim prophet in a plot to destroy Britain's empire, is, in some sense, Buchan's Kim. A new and more sinister Great Game commenced with the beginning of World War I in 1914, masterminded in Berlin, but unleashed from Constantinople. This took the form of a holy war against the British in India and the Russians in Central Asia, fought out between the intelligence services of the king, the Kaiser, the Sultan, and the Tsar. Buchan was then closely involved in intelligence work and had ready access to the secret reports of German activity in the East. Next image. This is a painting of Barik Khan, who was a real Afghan horse dealer, by Rudolf Svoboda, an Austrian painter who painted the Kiplings in India. In Greenmantle, Sir Walter Bullivant, permanent secretary to the Foreign Office and employer of secret agents, briefs Richard Hannay, with whom he had worked in 39 Steps, and the echoes of the old subcontinental contest and of Kipling's Afghan horse dealer, Mahbub Ali, are hard to miss. Quote, it is a great game, and you are the man for it, no doubt. I have reports from agents everywhere, peddlers in South Africa, Afghan horse dealers, Turkoman merchants, pilgrims on the road to Mecca, as well as respectable consuls who use ciphers. They tell the same story. The East is waiting for a revelation, some star is coming out of the West. The Germans know, and that is the card with which they are going to astonish the world. Close quote. The premier historian of this conflict in the First World War, Peter Hopkirk, notes that the German strategy of a drive to the east, the Drang nach Osten, took in the whole of British India and Burma, with the aid of smuggled arms, funds, and crates of revolutionary India smuggled into India behind the innocuous dust wrappers of English classics. Berlin hoped to foment violent revolutionary upbringings among the rested natives, whether Muslims, Sikhs, or Hindus, the very insurrectionist aim of those foiled by Carré and Kim 4 decades in fictional time before. Another favorite author of Allen Dulles was Ian Fleming, here shown with Sean Connery. Dulles politically wooed Jack Kennedy by sending copies of new Bond novels as soon as he got his hands on them to the senator and his wife. Jackie Kennedy had given Dulles From Russia with Love in the first place. Fleming, who passed away in 1964, never announced an affection for Kipling. Nevertheless, in his creation of the greatest code name ever for the modern spy, 007, he was almost certainly channeling Kipling's use of the masking number for the secret agent. Lurgan Sahib, in first speaking of the Bengali Babu, tells Kim that, quote, he has no name, but only a number and a letter. That is the custom among us. The origins of the 00 title may date to Fleming's wartime service. Agents of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, were given an O prefix when they became 0 rated upon completion of training in how to kill. Bond's 00 number was awarded to him because he twice killed in fulfilling assignments. In the first of the series, Casino Royale, the 00 concept is introduced. In the second, Live and Let Die, the number designates a past killing. And not until the third, Moonraker, does the 00 number designate a license to kill. We're a long way now from Agent R-17, the obese Babu, under Churi Mukherjee. But the use of a code number by Fleming seems clearly derived from Kipling and Kim, because survey work undertaken by the pundits, the Indian name for the real surveyors working on surveys for the Raj, could extend up to and beyond the frontier, their lives might be in danger and secrecy was necessary. Thus, the original pundits were known by code names such as the Mullah, the Mirza, and the Munshi. When their leader, shown here, Captain T.G. Montgomery, began publishing their reports in the Royal Geographical Society Journal, code names were employed, often simply initials or numbers. Number 1, the Patmon, or GM, and the third pundit, or GK. Kipling borrowed the idea of code names from the journal accounts. In Kim, Mahbub Ali is C25, 1B. The Babu Hari is R-17, and the Maratha whom Kim helps to disguise is E-23. In the novel, Kim wishes that, quote, he could enjoy the dignity of a letter and a number and a price upon his head. The greatest British spy novel of the 20th century, John le Carré, who passed away only recently in 2020, a veteran of both MI5 and MI6, who depicted their characteristics in his fictional Circus, was more interested in internal treachery within the Secret Service or between rival nations' services, a ruthless, impersonal, cerebral contest than in great power border contentions abroad. Nevertheless, he was fascinated with Kim, and he hated Fleming's Bond, calling him, quote, the ultimate prostitute, and, quote, the ideal defector. And of course, all were influenced by the Cambridge Five. As one literary critic has observed, well, references, muted and ironic, are frequent within his novels of the circus. Like Kipling's, his fictive imagination was inspired by contemporary history. His principal hero villains, Bill Hayden of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Magnus Pym of A Perfect Spy, are both based partly on the notorious British traitor and KGB double agent Harold Adrian Russell Kim Philby. Notably, Le Carré's charming adult spy, Magnus Pym of A Perfect Spy, has a last name that rhymes with the teenage Kims. And to be the perfect spy is to deceive even oneself with the sincerity of one's play acting. Indeed, Kim Philby might be said to have been constructed along the lines of Kipling's teenage hero. He was born in 1920 and 1912 in Ambala in the Punjab, one of the fictitious Kim's haunts of British parentage, and earned his nickname for his baby fluency in Punjabi. Years later in Moscow, after resigning from MI6 under suspicion in 1951 and then fleeing to Russia, after belated exposure as one of the Cambridge Five with Guy Burgess and Donald McLean, Philby explained, quote, "I spent more time with the servants and other Indians than I did with my own parents, so I picked up soon some words in Punjabi. One day, my father came into the kitchen and heard me chattering away. Good heavens, he said, he's a real little Kim. Everyone began calling me Kim, and the name stuck." This is too simple an explanation. His father, H. St. John St. John Philby, 1885-1960, later famous for his career in the Middle East, was a self-dramatizing Indian civil service officer who first lived and worked in the Punjab and Lahore, where Kim is set. He gave the boy his nickname at age 2 in 1914. And in the words of the father and son's dual biographer, quote, "The name touched the British heart. It meant something in the Raj and other official classes. The young man on duty on the frontiers of empire, the subaltern working for the common good, that of the Occident and the Orient in the foothills of the Himalayas. It had something imperial and admirable about it. No other name of the period had such resonance, for it bespoke romance and adventure in distant parts." Close quote. Philby's chief in MI6 was Sir Stuart Menzies, known as C, transmitted to M in Fleming's Bond novels. In a reminiscence published in the Times of London at Menzies' death, an Eton schoolmate recollected that their housemaster in that school, Edward Impey, quote, "had a profound love and admiration for the works of Kipling and Co. and Kim. Had the book played its part in Philby's apartment to the Secret Service?" Close quote. When Russian cables from 1945 were decoded in the frantic search for the Cambridge Spies' third man, Philby's codename was jarringly Stanley. Here is his famous news conference in which he successfully denied being the third man. According to Le Carré's extended analysis of Kim Philby and his father, quote, "He could hardly fall when his father delivered him over to the establishment for his education to feel already that he was being trained in the enemy camp. Like Kipling's boy, one feels he was already waiting for the call. Quote, it was intrigue, of course." Le Carré continues, "He knew that much. He'd known all evil since he could speak. But what he loved was the game for its own sake, the stealthy prowl through the dark gullies and lanes." Close quote. Carré does not reveal here that he's quoting from Kim itself. "The boy delighted," wrote Kipling, in quote, "the stealthy prowl through the dark gullies and lanes, the crawl up a water pipe, and the headlong flight from housetop to housetop under the cover of the hot dark." Close quote. Not only is Philby the model for the traitor Bill Hayden in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, but in that novel, the retired MI6 agent turned preparatory school teacher Jim Prideaux reads Buchan to the boys in the dormitory and uses little Bill Roach to spy for him, like Mahbub Ali uses Kim, giving the boy purpose because he's what Prideaux calls a good watcher, who by his watchfulness helps protect Prideaux from strangers on the school grounds just as Kim saves Mahbub Ali from would-be assassins. Le Carré's Our Game, published in 1995, in its title alone invoked the great game of Kim. The story is about a former British intelligence operative, now a university professor, and his former MI6 handler, now a retired Treasury boffin. By the end, both Britons end up with AK-47s joining the rebels in Ingushetia in the Caucasus to fight Russians. Kipling's influence is to be found too in Le Carré's The Secret Pilgrim from 1990, a group of linked short stories. Le Carré's provisional title for this book was Plain Tales from the Circus, an allusion to Kipling's Plain Tales from the Hills of 1888. As we've seen, the organized spy service of the Great Game is almost entirely Kipling's invention. There was no intelligence service, nor an ethnological department. There was only a governmental task force called the Survey of India, which was entrusted with the task of charting in surveys all India. In this sense, Kipling's ethnographical department is as invented as Le Carré's The Circus. Kim is not in the end about the glory of the British Empire, but about the wonder of the human spirit of heroism. In her The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt observed, quote, playing the great game, a man may feel as though he lives the only life worthwhile because he's been stripped of everything which may still be considered to be accessory. Life itself seems to be left in a fantastically intensified purity when man has cut himself off from all ordinary ties, family, regular habits, occupation, a definite goal, ambition, and the guarded place in a community to which he belongs by birth. Bonamy Debray, one of Kipling's most perceptive critics, put it differently and more simply. Quote, man is playing a great game of to be or not to be in the face of an indifferent universe. Mahbub Ali also tells Colonel Crichton of the boy, when he comes to the great game, he must go alone and at the peril of his head. Then, if he spits or sneezes or sits down, other than as the people do whom he watches, he may be slain. In the next chapter, Kim tells Mahbub Ali, I see my road all clear before me in a good service. Kim seems to perceive that he's being initiated into a select, elite, and secret society for whom unselfish service to others, even in the face of death, is paramount, spying not for patriotism or to practice violence or for pay. The pay, he declares, is the least part of the work. He's been prepared by his instructors to embody the intellectual strength and moral standing to handle the truths that are above other people, be they practical or spiritual. In his book, Grand Strategies, Literature, Statecraft, and World Order, the late former diplomat and Yale historian Charles Hill writes about Kim's great game. Well, it is a game, but it is deadly serious as well. A Hobbesian war of all against all, epitomized when Russian and French agents viciously beat up the Lama. The empire must be protected by espionage in the first instance, by war, if it must come to that, close quote. A game is finally simply a game, and no matter how seriously the great game may be taken by the players, an adult will always know the ultimate inconclusiveness, if not futility, the frequent loss, if not tragedy, of such an enterprise. In 1901, Rudyard Kipling wrote in Kim, when everyone is dead, the great game is finished, not before. In 1967, Ian Fleming wrote in The Spy Who Loved Me, quote, it's nothing but a complicated game, but then so's international politics, diplomacy, all the trappings of nationalism and the power complex. It goes on between countries. Nobody will stop playing the game, close quote. It's the appeal of spy novels today to their readers and to spies. I will conclude with the sobering reflection of one of our greatest modern military historians, John Keegan, whom I've quoted before, And this was written 2 years before or after 9/11 about the urgent need of modern espionage services to combat foreign terrorist cells. Quote, the challenge will cast the agencies back into the methods which have come to appear outdated, even primitive, in the age of satellite surveillance and computer decryption. Kipling's Kim, who has survived into modern times only as the delightful literary creation of a master novelist, may come to provide a model of the anti-fundamentalist agent with his ability to shed his European identity and to pass convincingly as a Muslim message carrier, Hindu gallant, and Buddhist holy man's hanger-on, far superior to any holder of a PhD in higher mathematics, close quote. Given what happened in our exit from Afghanistan and Kabul with our misaimed drone strike during a withdrawal from that airport, that appraisal now seems prophetic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David, for your intriguing presentation. May I remind participants that they may submit questions using the dedicated Q&A module at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We do have a number of questions, and I'm going to go ahead and start with them from Edward Corey. He says, you suggested that the Cold War started in March 1945, but isn't it more accurate to say that it began with George Kennan's response in the long telegram in January 1947 to Stalin's Bolshoi theater speech of February 1946?
One could make that argument. Of course, George Kennan with that famous telegram arguing for containment advocated that strategy. So that is a possible appraisal of when the Cold War started as well. But of course, through the end of World War II and with Yalta, Russia was our ally, and how confrontational we could be took a while to become more apparent.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question from Sandra Picard. Please comment on Kipling's lyrical similes of particularly chapters 13 and 14, including like sitting in a swallow's nest under the eaves of the roof of the world, referring to Babu's landmark umbrella. It nodded like a wind-blown harebell down the valleys and round the mountainside. Also, a study of the silly sahibs who spent money with a spade.
Well, I'm more a historian than a literary critic, and those were images, of course, that a novelist could employ. Kipling spent time in Shimla. He was a reporter in the Northwest frontier. The Babu's umbrella was one of his trademarks, and Kipling's characterization of it is a respectful one. But thank you for pointing out those, and there are many other graceful notes in the book overlying its more serious story.
Okay, another question is it possible to get a copy of this wonderful, fascinating talk? I can respond to that because it has been recorded, and one can go ahead and go to the ESU national website, and they can listen to it at that point another time. Don Patillo doesn't have a question, but he has kudos for a magnificent job. And another question that I think this will probably be our last question. Since you are the largest collector of the books and manuscripts of Kipling in the world, how did you get started at that?
I attended Cambridge, and I'd never been out of the United States before, and I'd never studied anything other than American history. And I studied modern history, and the Second British Empire, our country having fallen away in the first, was something that fascinated me. I had started to collect the World War I poets, Gray, Sassoon, and Owen, and I discovered that they were very heavily collected with Wilfred Owen, who may be better than Sassoon as a poet. He dies on the last day of World War I. There are only 6 books. You have a complete Owen collection. But I soon realized that with Kipling, I could get World War I, where his son died in the same battle as the late Queen's mother, the Battle of Loos in 1917. Their son's body was never found. It broke Kipling. He thought the greatest book he ever wrote was the 2-volume History of the Irish Guards, which I'll bet American money none of you have ever heard of. But he was out of favor in terms of collecting, much more expensive to collect Hemingway or Fitzgerald in a dust jacket rather than Captains Courageous in a dust jacket. And so I thought that pursuing him, who had gone a bit out of favor with the anti-colonial attacks on Edwardian attitudes, which he shared. He did have, as he said, 2 sides to his head, but he nonetheless sometimes used tropes which modern readers find difficult. So I started to collect him, and I went on eBay. I still do it every Friday night for the last 35 years. Eventually built up a collection. It's now in the Meineke Library, and soon started spending more than merely eBay bids at auctions. I found it very satisfying. Wrote a bibliography, an 800-page bibliography of Kipling, which is now the standard bibliography. The Times Literary Supplement said I knew more about Kipling's book than Kipling did, which is true. But that's only about the books. That's not about things like the similes and the graceful writing that the prior questioner asked me about. It started as well, just to finish the thought. You are all, I suspect, old enough to remember the crash of 1999, not the financial crash of 2008. And that was when the savings and loan banks went under. I got clinical depression. I thought I'd brought all that legal business in. I thought it was my fault when it went out. I was wrong, but I still got sick. And the shrink suggested I start collecting, which I'd done as an undergraduate, although then biographies of American presidents. And I did that. And then I started doing a computer catalog in my basement. And somebody found out about that. And then an American publisher called O'Neill and the British Library, since there hadn't been a bibliography of Kipling in over 50 years, chose to publish it. And it is now the standard reference for Christie's and Sotheby's and rare book dealers. And I continue to find his work interesting, and this kind of playful journey through British and American espionage history and novelists is just another way of playing with my toys, I guess. But that's how I got started.
David, thank you so very much. And I'd like to also thank the participants for their very thoughtful questions. I'm sorry that we were running out of time and we had a couple more questions. I apologize for that. But at this point in time, I'd like to turn the program over to the English Speaking Union Executive Director, Karen Karpowicz, for final remarks. And again, David, thank you so much. It was absolutely most fascinating. Thank you.
I enjoyed it myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I think that our education on Kipling is really lacking the breadth of what he represents, and his influence in the past 100 years is really powerful. So thank you very much. It's been a spin that I didn't even know some of this stuff. So thank you. And As Barbara mentioned, I'm Karen Karpwich, the Executive Director of the English Speaking Union, and I want to thank the Greenwich branch, as all of these programs are curated by our branches and the talent within our branches. So thank you very much. I also wanted to mention the fact that the ESU is a member organization. And if you're not a member, we encourage you to become one and be part of this and a myriad of other things that's been going on. This week was our National Shakespeare competition at Lincoln Center, where we had 40 of the most talented young people in America coming to New York to compete with doing monologues and sonnets, and it was a kind of very inspiring, wonderful event. So I encourage you to become part of our community. I hope I see you all back again here on May 17th, when our chairman, Dr. Quinn Pieper, is going to be hosting an event, and it's going to be on a character named Flora MacDonald, who is a woman who actually existed, a Scottish heroine and American loyalist. And it's based on a book written by her descendant, Flora Fraser, who was named after Flora MacDonald. And I've met Flora, and she's an amazing woman. You'll find her fascinating and very interesting. And that's on May 17th at 4 p.m. back here. So please register, and we'll see you real soon. Thank you again.